Hey guys, it's Malthus here once again, and back with another edition of reviewing my builds for the league. This time around it was Crucible League, which was a pretty fucking long league, but we didn't actually play the entire thing. So there's really not that many builds compared to usual. Usually I'm somewhere in like the 15 to 20 build range. This time around I did 11 builds for the entire league. Got interrupted by Diablo 4, ExileCon, Boulderfest, all kinds of shit. Still have 11 builds to review, go over. Crucible League itself was I'd say, actual pretty cool league. The mechanic itself, like, yeah, not everyone loved it. Yeah, wasn't the best to engage with, but what it resulted in was pretty fucking amazing. A lot of extra build variety, a lot of cool stuff from gear, and power creep. So I was pretty experimental here or there, but had some pretty damn strong builds. And also Vengeant Cascade was happening this league, so that was a crazy addition for projectile builds. And honestly, kind of just felt a bit too much and a bit cheese. Either way, we used it and it was great. So anyway, let's get into it. And the first build we are rating is the Shot Deadeye. Yeah, Shot Deadeye starter. Shot Deadeye was actually an amazing starter. Possibly one of the best starters I've had in a long time, or ever. So Shot itself didn't have anything too drastic change, except for the fact that it got a Vial version attached to it. And that means that you could cover your single target just as well as you could cover your AoE with the same skill. Previously, Shot, it's a decent clear skill, pretty much usurped by Lightning Arrow in every way, but it has its own flavor. It's pretty cool. And now it has a Vial skill that separates itself from Lightning Arrow to some extent, and in this way it gave you a lot of single target. Also just a very cool Vial skill to press because it gives you copies of yourself that shoot lots of extra ice shots. And then on top of that, once we discovered what Vengeant Cascade was for the league, we realized that pretty much every bow build is going to be overpowered, and every projectile build, even this league, was going to be overpowered. This character didn't actually use Vengeant Cascade for quite a long time. I didn't really want to dive into it yet. I was just happy doing normal non-Vengeant Cascade gameplay, but once I did try Vengeant Cascade out, or I could afford to do it after getting through my whole starter gear situation, once we did try it out, it was obviously very strong and too good to not use. So we leaned into that and then started using it, and it became a fucking mess. Like, every single projectile build just turns into a huge spam of projectiles all over your screen, and it's ridiculous. Either way, Vengeant Cascade will be going away next league, and there's going to be a return proj support instead, which will likely be worth using in almost every proj build either way. We still need to see gem info for that, but it should be worth using. Other than that, it's still going to be very good for certain projectiles utility. So see if there's any good action here. So there you go. This is kind of the craziness that ends up starting to happen. It was still a very basic character for most of my playthrough, but with this one being as good as it was and the potential it had, I ended up taking it all the way through to Uber bosses, and it was very cheap and very effective to get to that point. So this is me like testing some Vengeant Cascade and testing with and without it, and it felt kind of similar, but ultimately Vengeant Cascade was definitely the right play. So this character was amazing. I loved Shot. I loved just the starter progression of it, and bow builds in general are pretty damn strong these days to start out with. They're pretty damn strong across the board, so you can't really go wrong with just almost any bow skill and a bow starter. It's going to be a bit squish, it's going to be a bit gear based to really start ramping, but they are overall just have the damage. They got a few extra changes in the passive tree to become a bit better for projectiles and stuff, and they feel comfortable. They're nice, they're fun. So either way, this is the Deadeye version for Shot as a starter. The effectiveness, it did everything in the game. It wasn't the best for like single target in the end, but for what it was, I'd say it's got to be about a 9. The enjoyment, I had a lot of fun on this thing. It's not peak fun because, you know, it's not doing anything super weird or super crazy, but it's very comfortable. It's very enjoyable to play. and enjoyable to build and progress through. And the budget, it's definitely pretty budget as well. It can be pretty cheap, it can be pretty expensive, as any bow build is. It can ramp all the way to the moon, but to begin with, it can be pretty damn cheap and get you very far. And I think even without Vengeant Cascade, it's going to be very good. I'd say it's also a 9. Can it be a starter? It very much can, and was. And that's a pretty fucking good score. And I thought it was actually going to be pretty tough to top Ice Shot as kind of build of the league, just because of knowing how starter viable it is and its budget and all that. But it does end up getting topped. Either way, really good score for that. The next build was kind of an experimental and highly provisional one, and it was maybe even too early for a second build like this, because it probably would have wanted a bit more gear and probably a bit more planning. But the new thing was trigger bots with Saboteur, and I wanted to get into that pretty fucking quick and give it a shot and see what this trigger bot business was like. And it didn't seem like it was going to be worth doing as a starter, because that would have hurt. It became a visual nightmare slash beauty. It was amazing with the MTX that we had, and I also tried to use Prismatic Burst for the first time, since that was new as well. Prismatic Burst ended up being very questionable. It's a tough thing to scale. It's a tough thing to like justify in a build. It looks great and it kind of functions well, but at the same time, for the amount of investment we put into it, the amount of effort we put forward towards it, it wasn't really packing quite as much of a punch as we would have wanted to. But this build was supposed to be like a Spellslinger hybrid of a lot of things. So it did utilize Crucible for Ice Nova into Glacial Cascade, so there's like 2 spells in one there. It did have Reap with a like bunch of conversion and Ele damage, and then also Prismatic Burst, and it was Spellslinger, so just casting with a frenzy and having a bunch of spells go off. It's going to have just horrible visuals because there's a Righteous Fire and all these kinds of other spells going off, so you won't be able to tell too much what's happening. And it was an okay build in the end. Like, it did most things. It felt okay, but for what we tried to do with it, for the amount of damage I tried to get, it still became kind of squishy, and it didn't really have enough damage for what I would have wanted given that squishiness. So it was kind of a mishmash of several types of like building strategy, that sort of thing, and then nothing really came to fruition, I don't think, to make it feel truly good. It was an attempt, it was a bit of an experiment, somewhat of a failed one, but it was good enough to play, it was good enough to copy. I just think there's definitely going to be better examples of trigger bots, which I think I did later in the league, a slightly better example, and there's got to be better examples of Prismatic Burst as well. So with that, if you want to give that some ratings and effectiveness, it was pretty good at clear. It was kind of okay at boss fights, but it did most things comfortably enough, and it was fun enough to play. So that's, once again, with the enjoyment there. The visuals were great. Putting it together was kind of fun, and just the whole thing was not too bad, but ultimately needed a bit more single target, a bit more tankiness to be truly enjoyable. Budget, I would not call it very good on the budget, because these casts on crit or like spell triggering type builds definitely need some real fine-tuned gear and all the right stuff for all the moving parts to come together to feel good. And without that, you're usually left thinking something's wrong with my build. So you don't want to go in without the right budget for these types of things. I'd call it more like a 5. It can be done pretty cheap. It wasn't super expensive, but it can't really be done without some established level of currency. Can it be a starter? I mean, I think if you really wanted to, it might be able to be a starter, but I wouldn't recommend it. So honestly, I'm gonna have to give it a no. And then by their powers combined, I'm gonna say that's like 20. Next build was another pretty crazy one, but this one was fairly fucking effective in the end, and it was a good example of basically bringing back old Vile Pact and Instant Leech, but this is in the form of having some Instant Leech, but at the same time lots of life gain on hit, and a lot of projectiles and hits from Molten Strike. This was Molten Strike JUGG that stacked accuracy Dex, and some Int with the new Hand of Thought and Motion, Claw that turned lightning Dex into lightning damage. We also used the boots for lightning damage through accuracy, and it was just a shitload of damage with a lot of attack speed and a lot of life gain on hit, and we could build pretty thick as a JUGG as well. This was Molten Strike, so with the new Vengeant Cascade, it was kind of a bit cheese, using kind of like doubled up balls for the return proj as well as the original hit, so it's probably not going to be quite as good next league without Vengeant Cascade, but for this league we gave ourselves 2 or 3 uses of Vengeant Cascade, knowing how overpowered and fun it was going to be, and it was very strong. And like I said, the main purpose behind this thing was to essentially get tanky enough to be able to take some hits, and then fast enough attacks and enough recovery that we'd bounce our health back up to full no matter what. And that definitely did what it was supposed to do. Took on, I think, all the Uber bosses and face tanked almost every attack in the game. It was some pretty crazy shit. The budget for it wasn't anything too huge, but it was going to be a bit tough to put together. And at the same time, it went through a lot of iterations. It took me a while to fine-tune the build to the best of my ability, went all over the passive tree, tried to stack like Int and Dex at the same time, instead had to do like more one than the other. It was pretty crazy. But Molten Strike still, as always, basically hasn't ever not been good in PoE. I think it's been pretty damn good recently though, and just wanted to show off a bit of the proper gameplay out and about. It's not the best on clear, but it can be decent enough, especially with some additional strikes from the tree, from Ancestral Call, etc. And then for bossing, it's just one of the best melees out there. Not too sure how it's going to be this league with the Vengeant Cascade thing, but it was good before that, and it'll be good after that, maybe just slightly less good. Either way, great build and pretty good concept, I think. So for that, the effectiveness, it wasn't the best on clear, so it's hard to give it a 10, right? But it did like kill all Ubers, and it could face tank lots of stuff. It was pretty fucking effective. So we have to give it like at least a 9, but if you don't care too much about like mass clear, I think it's fair to even give it a 10. Enjoyment, still felt, you know, pretty much like a Molten Strike, just strike style character, but it was very fast with the amount of attack speed we had. It was a JUGG, so it's thick, it's sustained, so it was pretty fun because of that. That's got to be a pretty good 9 as well. And then the budget for that one, we can have a quick look at the character. It wasn't anything too crazy. It did require some okay stuff, a particular jewel, nothing too crazy. It's just some putting together of certain pieces of gear that you wouldn't realistically have until like maybe a week in. Stat stackers are typically kind of tough to do off of no currency, but once you establish a little bit of currency, then without a full min-max, they're not that expensive. I'd say it's relatively cheap for what it is. Kind of high up there. 7. Can it be a starter? You wouldn't do this as a starter. It'd be hard to put together in that capacity. So with that, we got ourselves a nice, comfy 25. Pretty good score. The following build was yet another Crucible concoction, and one that is kind of a classic build, but Crucible gives it a slightly different, fresh spin, and that is Exsanguinate and Reap. Still has damage over time, especially using the inherent damage over times that it has, but converting it to fire. So Crucible had a mod that would turn all of the physical dot of Exsanguinate and Reap into fire instead. So the idea was to then do an Elementalist, similar to the way I did a Exsanguinate Elementalist in the past, but also focusing on Ignite damage for the initial hit. It turned out to be a pretty decent build. Still stacking golems, so lots of generic damage, lots of generic defense and regen and all of that. But combining both skills instead of just the one for Exsanguinate to have lots of different physical damage over time, converted to fire damage over time, and then an initial decent amount of Ignite hit. So this build will no longer be doable in this exact same capacity next league, because no Crucible mod, but physical damage over time, Reap and Exsanguinate, still absolutely viable and doable through an Elementalist or a Trickster or a Scion, some stuff like that. You probably just won't really be focused or using Ignite as part of this sort of setup. You still technically could, as an Elementalist, have all of your like physical damage, deal Ignite damage as well. I'm just not sure it'd be actually worth it. But the result of the character was the same as what I remember Exsanguinate being the first time around. With Chain, with damage over time, it becomes a very smooth clearing character, has good AoE potential, kind of thick, kind of good regen, so good sustain. Nothing too crazy on the single target, because to get these to really high single target, you have to scale lots and lots of gem level. You've got to scale as much sort of damage over time multi as possible, and it does get pretty tough to do. And the other versions would instead use Corrupting Fever if you're going pure Fizz Dot. So they can be really big, but to get to that level, they need to become pretty expensive. But these types of builds, Exsanguinate and Reap, can be pretty decent as starters and somewhat versatile with the Ascendancies, as I mentioned. Can't do the Fire version anymore, like Crucible, but can do the Fizz Dot ones, and they're pretty nice builds. They're not the craziest, they're not the biggest, they're not going to go the furthest, I don't think, but pretty solid all around and fun to do. So to give that some of the ratings, we got ourselves an effectiveness. From memory, the bossing wasn't insane, but it was still pretty good. I'm going to say, look, the clear was unreal, the bossing was decent. I think that's another fair 9. We've had some pretty effective builds, and we'll get to some less effective possibly soon, but I think it was a pretty good league for builds overall for lots of Crucible stuff. The enjoyment, I'd say that was pretty high as well. Fun to put together, fun to play. Could have been, could have been a bit more comfortable without the golems dying all the time. So in the background, as I was just then watching the Simulacrum, that's one of the worst places for golems and elementalists, and it's kind of frustrating when they die there. But they did live in almost everything else, so it's not too bad. Enjoyment just takes a bit of a hit because of some clumsiness here or there. The budget, it's really not much of a budget build in the end, especially the way I built it. If we have a quick look at it, like I went with lots of +1s and the right fine-tuned gear and the right Crucible mod, the right +4 corrupted chest, which it wasn't expensive, but it's going to be hard to get. And then on top of that, I went out of my way to get some pretty good megalomaniacs, which not too many other people were going for, but it's really hard to copy this type of a setup. So the budget wasn't insane by any means, but it'd be damn near impossible to copy this build. So I don't know, we have to give that a pretty low budget. Because of that, something like a 3. So it should overall still be a pretty good score, but realistically, it can't have a great one. Can it be a starter? This specific version, no. Elementalist or Trickster as like a Reap Exsanguinate build, absolutely. Just, you can't like follow this one and copy this one. So no. And by those powers combined, that becomes a 21. Next build was yet another pretty good one, but once again, kind of based around some meme shit, and that was the new Crucible staff that had built-in links. So I basically went shopping for Crucible staffs because they have their own built-in links that you just find, and some are good, some are really shit. I went shopping to see what could happen on the budget end of things, but some really good ones. I found one that had a weird combo of stuff. It had like Immolate and Arcane Surge and Ice Bite, some shit like that, and thought I could put that together for a pretty cool brand character and try out the newly revamped Arcane Surge Hierophant nodes. So this was the first time I'd made a proper caster Hierophant, which wasn't a totem character, and it turned out really well. Stormbrand basically hasn't stopped being good for years now, and in today's world, Stormbrand is fairly versatile. It can be built in this way with the staff and the whole meme stuff, doing all kinds of elements. It can be done really well as like void batteries. It can be done really well as Archmage. is Annihilating Light, triple damage staff. So Stormbrand, pretty versatile, and ultimately, with this Hierophant example, still very strong. It mapped great. Using Lightning Warp, I could be a pretty speedy character. Stormbrand itself is just a great skill for bossing, because you apply a couple of brands, which are technically like damage over time, and then just run around and have damn near 100% uptime on your damage against every boss out there. Like, compared to some of the melee builds I'm playing, it's just night and day, where you get to, from range, basically at all times, apply 100% of your damage at all times. Like, that's just insane. And then some melee builds are going to sit there with 10% uptime. You have to wait for the boss to do certain things. You have to wait for your perfect opportune moment to finally get some damage in. So I'm pretty sure this character took on all Uber bosses. Wasn't super expensive to put together, but had some pretty unique items in its own right. So not the easiest to copy, but very easy to pivot into a different way of building this thing to still be just as effective. Stormbrand, great skill. Hierophant, great for casting with the new Arcane Surge. And that's a nice finish to that video. Either way, it's still uber serious. That fight's pretty bullshit. That was probably one of the only deaths I can remember on this character for Ubers. Effectiveness, I think it's 10. It wasn't the thickest character. The way I built it, it wasn't super thick, so it can't take lots of damage, but I built it not very thick, specifically because it is Stormbrand. Like, once you start playing Stormbrand and realize that your playstyle is essentially run around and never get hit, you start to take certain liberties in your squishiness. You can build it as thick as you like, but there's really not much reason to, especially when playing softcore. So I'd give it an effectiveness of 10 because it was great for clear, great for bossing, great for a playstyle. Enjoyment, pretty damn high. It's not too different from any other time I would have played Stormbrand is the only issue, because it's just another Stormbrand character, and there's only so much you can do innovating-wise there. It was fun to put together though, but I'd still give it like a 9 or something. The budget on this particular version, if we have a look at the budget, the certain gear, some pretty usual gear. The staff itself, very hard to replicate, but it only costs like a divine or some shit. And then you can definitely start a Stormbrand character as a starter. We did yoink Inquisitor nodes because we were doing like triple elemental damage here instead of just the usual 1 or 2 elements for a Stormbrand. We had to kind of do that. Overall, this one is pretty budget and can be pretty starter. I think that needs to be given a pretty high score. Because it's realistic to be able to do. So it's something like a 27, right? And can it be a starter? Not this exact version, but with the staff, I mean. But ignore the staff and everything else about it is starter viable. I'm going to have to give that kind of a yes. And you could use this exact template of the build just without the staff and some sort of other ingenuity. Or you can do it as an Inquisitor instead, which is also pretty good. Stormbrand, always been one of the good starters out there. Still definitely the case. Next build was yet again another visual glorious mess, but that's mostly just because of the old Kirak pass for Mjolnir, which creates these big lightning zaps down from the sky to the ground. And I mean, it was a bit blinding, but loved playing it, loved looking at it. And it was supposed to be a big meme attempt of a build, because this is Mjolnir Scion Doryani prototype using Absolution without the minion portion of it, just the actual hit portion, and also Wave of Conviction. The idea with this build was basically do some fizz into lightning convert, a lot of lightning damage, and then remove all enemies' lightning res, because I had minus 180 lightning res, which applies to enemies at that point, thanks to the chest. So all enemies around me had a minus 100 lightning minus 180 lightning res. I had minus 180 lightning res, and then you have to fix that by doing something. In this case, I used an Eyes of the Great Wolf that let all of my lightning damage be taken as fire damage. I capped my fire and cold res with Melding of Flesh, I think it's called, to 90. So I had 90 to those other 2 rares, and it became a pretty thick character. Overall, this was a very strong build. It ended up mapping pretty great. It killed all bosses, even Ubers, I believe, and it had pretty good single target. Not the best for, you know, what it is. I think it could have been a bit more single target. It probably had something like 20-30 million DPS, but it was still very solid. It's a very difficult character to put together, not only just because of the gear you're having to buy, so like budget wise, certain specific items. It's also just hard to balance because you need all kinds of certain stat ranges, int strength, you need all the right resists and in large capacities. You then need all the crit multis. It was tough to put together, no doubt about it. But when it did come together, it became a pretty good character, and visually I thought it was fairly stunning. So to also have another look at a boss fight or two, something like Uber Maven. You can see that the DPS wasn't anything crazy, but it was very strong for what it was. And you can see that there is going to be some melee playstyle issues thanks to Cyclone, as I was just talking about, compared to the Stormbrand, which has all the uptime in the world. It still has decent uptime because for a Cyclone build, for a melee build, you got to try and build a bit thick so you can actually be in there and take on some of the hits. We managed to do that well enough. It had good recovery, it had good defenses, but it's still a Doryani's build, which means it's susceptible to some forms of lightning damage, like lightning damage over time, so it could be a bit uncomfortable at times, but there's not too many things that do that. Overall, great build, really tough to put together, and tough to replicate. And I think you can do better on Mjolnir and Doryani prototype builds. So it was a bit of a one-of-a-kind and a decent example of a build, but I think we could also do better with the tools we're given. But very much pretty unique in its own way, and a good experiment and a successful thought experiment, I'd say. So the effectiveness of it, pretty fucking effective. Because of Doryani's prototype, there's a slight chink in the armor of the whole defensive setup, given lightning damage over time, but other than that, very strong. The enjoyment of it, it was pretty damn enjoyable. I think that's maybe even worth a 10. Cyclone's very fun, proccing spells very fun, lightning damage very fun. Mjolnir, always a great time. The budget, well, let's just have a quick look. Mjolnir with some weird Crucible shit, which not too many other people had. Getting all the right fire res, a shiny Devouring Diadem for God knows what reason. You got your Doryani's prototype, which I used with like plus skills for Absolution. Some real fancy gear. Eyes of the Great Wolf, which I may or may not have bought for very cheap because some guy listed it for very cheap when these things are actually like 70 divines. Not too many people were buying these, no one cared about it, so for some reason someone listed it fairly cheap. It was up for a while. I managed to get it for like, I don't know, 100C, something like that. Pretty good bro deal. First time I've ever used one of these, and it felt okay. Still didn't even feel that broken, not gonna lie. Other than that, yeah, look, some Forbidden Fleshes and Thread of Hopes and Melting of Flesh. It was just tough to put together, not gonna lie. So the budget on this thing, I don't think it's infinite, so I'm not going to say it's the most expensive or the most difficult, but let's give it something like a 1. Can it be a starter? It certainly can't. So overall, give that something like a 20. The next build is what I thought would be an unbeatable build of the league. So in the build title, I even said, hey, build of the league. And that's because up till that point, it was the strongest build I'd done this league, and it was always kind of going to be extremely strong. Like, I knew the potential of Volcanic Fissure, I knew the potential of Replica Alberons. This is the first time that I saw Replica Alberons being not that expensive in a few leagues, so I thought, this is my chance to make a pretty nice build with them and justify using a pretty overpowered setup of Volcanic Fissure, which was one of my previous build of the leagues, combined with Vengeant Cascade, which is overpowered and doubling the output of most projectile builds, and then combine it with the Alberons and poison scaling to create a pretty fucking nice build. So you have lots of poison damage and ramp in this type of setup. You have lots of sustain with the life gain on hit and lots of projectile overlap from Vengeant Cascade with Volcanic Fissure. And then you just kind of focus on some defenses so that you can take a lot of damage and just have really nice sustain. So this was a Pathfinder, which let me have near infinite flasks. I went with lots of armor evasion. I think I even went some block, which was kind of overkill. We also have Berserk as a sort of panic button, and extra damage reduction, because I think I used Comb's Spirit, something like that in the build. And overall, yeah, it was just an absolute beast of a character. It's going to be tough to replicate because you got your replica Alberons. I did use a Crucible axe, which had some pretty cool stuff on it. But it was a build that let me take on like the harshest of Crucible action, as well as plenty of uber bossing and stuff as well. Let me see if this one actually had any of the bossing action. It had a bit of Maven, I think. Maybe some uber bosses. It absolutely took on all the content out there and did it well, which is why it got Build of the League status by this point. It's also a build, or Volcanic Fissure itself is also a skill that can be very melee, and once you're melee, your damage comes in quite a bit faster, but it can also be ranged. So it's one of those that is pretty versatile because you can sit back and attack from a distance if you really need to, and still have lots of good damage coming in. You can see once the ramp kicks in, it becomes pretty fucking filthy, and yeah, it was always going to be this. I knew it had a great destiny ahead of itself in the form of Volcanic Fissure, Vengeant Cascade, and Replica Alberons. So Vengeant Cascade won't be the way it is next league, so we're going to lose some effectiveness there, but that's not going to change the outcome of a build like this. It's still going to be very insane, and Volcanic Fissure is still a very high-end build, at least in my opinion. So with that, the effectiveness, it's a 10. Pretty good at clear. You got poison prolif, you got like some range potential, you got very good sustain. The enjoyment, very fun to play. You can't go wrong with that. Pretty much has to be at 10. The budget, it's pretty expensive, I suppose. It's kind of put together in the exact same way. Replica Alberons, probably going to be expensive, as always. Don't know why they were particularly cheap this league. Outside of that, it's just strength stack. So high-end strength stack or high-end any stat stack can be pretty expensive. On the low end, it's not too hard to put together, but to min-max, it definitely takes a lot. The Crucible tree was tough for this sort of character, which won't be relevant anymore, but for this one, I'd say it was pretty high-end. And otherwise, what, a Megalomaniac that was decent, Lethal Pride that was decent. It's not infinite budget, once again, but Replica Alberon, I mean, they're always a high starting point. So I wouldn't want to say it's something you can do easily, because you shouldn't be able to do this easily based off of Replica Alberon. Not the worst, though. I don't know, probably give that like a 2. So even though we called this Build of the League, right? It's a 22, whatever the fuck that means. Can it be a starter? Volcanic Fissure, absolutely can. And I think I even included it as a starter in a previous one. It just takes a little bit of ramp. Takes a little bit of slowness to begin with, but it gets very strong. And Volcanic Fissure, intuitively, you would think it's supposed to be kind of this slow slam thing. But once you get it with some good attack speed and instead build towards speed, it becomes pretty fun and pretty strong. Can it be a starter? This one, it cannot. So with that, a 22. The next build was a highly experimental and highly meme build. It was Elemental Hit as melee, which isn't the worst concept, and I think I have done 1 or 2 before that aren't too bad. But this one was using a staff. So staff-based melee elemental hit. and it was using the Annihilating Light triple damage staff. So it was a tough build to kind of rationalize, but it was mostly doable thanks to Crucible and the fact that we could get 40 extra attack speed built into a weapon, because typically the staff-based playstyle is pretty slow, but Annihilating Light has no attack speed whatsoever, and we had to overcome that by getting a lot of attack speed through Crucible, and then I scaled some attack speed as a champion with haste and some other attack speed, and that's how you kind of get rid of the attack speed issue. And then we have all three elements. We're dealing all kinds of elements, and you can see that the playstyle ended up being somewhat decent. It's just kind of like basic strike skill action, but you do have the splash from elemental hit. It became pretty damn thick for a champion, and then yeah, kind of put together a melee elemental hit staff based champion. It was decent. It ultimately, I think, needed to do more damage. It did enough to do some good clear, and the clear was definitely the highlight of the build, surprisingly, given that it's a strike skill. But with enough additional strikes, like Ancestral Call, additional strike on the tree, some shit like that, it was a pretty stable character that had good enough defenses, good enough clear. But then when push came to shove, you really did want more single target when you're this melee of a character. So just as a quick refresher for DPS, yeah, it's not bad for that type of thing, and it was good for most of the game. But then I'm pretty sure by the time you get to Ubers on something like this, you go, oh no, Ubers are shit because I'm melee. Yeah, I don't know if we even had any Uber footage on this one. It's basically just the usual melee problem if you get to Ubers and you go, oh, my melee build isn't that fun anymore. Unless it has probably about 2 or 3 times the damage of this character, which it didn't. So yeah, if we just have a quick look, it was something like 8 million DPS, but this isn't a real indication of the DPS because it's got like 3 elements and it like rotates and it has high rolls and low rolls. But for a melee Uber character, it needs something like 20 to 30 million, or maybe at least 15 plus. Either way, it wasn't quite there, but it was, as you can see, a fairly thick character. It had some unique aspects to it. A little bit tough to put together because I went kind of all out to make this meme a reality. So to give it some ratings, the effectiveness, I'm going to say it's something like a 7 because it had okay clear. It had okay single target. The clear was honestly a bit better. Nothing too special there. The enjoyment, it was really fun to put together. It was okay to play in the end. I think that probably deserves a 7 as well. Budget, it's definitely had to pull out a few stops to make this a reality, and I'd say it's not super well budgeted. Maybe more like a 4. Not the most expensive thing, but a little bit tough. So can it be a starter? It can't. Could you technically do melee Ele Hit as a starter? I think so. As a berserker, maybe as a slayer, wouldn't be too bad, but it would pale in comparison to some other things you could do as starters. Definitely be a bit weak. More of a second or third character if you want to do some melee Ele Hit. So the total on that one, pretty low score, somewhat deservedly so, but nice proof of concept, and I did not regret doing it. The next build was another huge pile of memes, but once again entirely enabled and done through the use of Crucible, which is Venom, Gyre, Bleed. I decided to take this one on personally because I don't think I saw anyone else care about this one yet, and it was a Crucible modifier that let your Venom, Gyre, and I think Cobra Lash as well, do no chaos damage, no conversion, and instead do fizz and do extra bleeding damage. And I thought, hey, that actually looks like it might be kind of good. So the idea was to then roll a pretty slow claw, stack many bleeds through the use of Crimson Dance, and just have a good fast character with Venom Gyre as a huge clear because it clears insane, and then it's also got bleed pops, and then good reliable single target because bleed just pretty reliable. Once you get your bleeds up and rolling, they're just going to sit there. They're going to do good damage, good consistent damage, and it doesn't even have to be 2 melee range in this capacity. This also allowed me to build the character fairly thick. I think I went max block because it was a gladiator, spell suppress capped, And from what I remember, it did most Uber bosses. Nothing too crazy, like 5 million consistent bleed damage with some extra Corrupting Fever as well, maybe? Yeah, and that was decent enough. There's not too much else to say, I don't think, about this character. It's something that just straight up cannot be done anymore beyond Crucible, because that Crucible mod won't exist. To do a similar sort of character, it'd basically have to be Spectral Shield Throw, which is a thing. Pretty reliable Glad build that's been happening this entire time. It's nothing too crazy though, and it's not really had any differences in recent memories. So this one is just something a bit special in its own right. Pretty good build, I think. Let's just have a quick look at a boss clip. So this will show you what the single target's like. Nothing too crazy, but like I said, reliable. And an Uber version of the boss fight. So it took on some Ubers. It was a very unique build for what it was. Would have liked a bit more damage, I think, but I was surprised enough that Venom Gyre could be turned into a bleed build and could function well enough. So that's pretty good for like Uber boss damage, I think, for a bleed build, and for one that got fairly thick. So we then go to the rating effectiveness. Let's say we give it like an 8, because we probably would have wanted a bit more single target, but I don't think that's unfair at all. Great clear, decent enough single target at around 5 million, but it is still like kind of a bleed build that has a hard cap. The enjoyment, it was pretty damn enjoyable. What needed to change to be a 10? Because I think it needs to lose something. It feels like a 9. Probably more single target, sure. And then the budget, it wasn't super hard to put together, wasn't super expensive. It's just a bleed build, and most gear slots are fairly fucking flexible in these things. But we did focus on Corrupting Fever as well as just the Venom Gyre. So the Corrupting Fever did like 1 million damage, and then the Venom Gyre itself was dealing like 5 million. It's pretty hard to put together. I'd call that like a budget of maybe 3 or 4. Can it be a starter? This one, no. Bleed Glad in a shield, Spectral Shield Throw environment could be a starter, but it's unrelated. Just letting you know that you can do Bleed Glad still, even though Gladiator is kind of like overdue a rework. I'm struggling to math this thing out. What do we got? A 21? Not too bad. The next build ended up being the decisive build of the league. So I thought it was going to be pretty tough to top the Volcanic Fissure build, and it was going to be tough to top it, but this one kinda had to get build of the league in the end. It had to go over the top, and I'm pretty sure I just slapped it down in the title, called it that. Yeah, build of the league. For several reasons. So first of all, this was Ethereal Knives with Blade Blast as an Inquisitor. So it was the first time I'd ever used the Nimmy's ring. Nimmy's is a ring that makes your projectiles go in random directions around you, and your projectiles return to you. Previous to this league, it was pretty damn expensive, pretty rare, but not too many people were using it anymore, especially with Vengeant Cascade in the game, and it became like a one divine item. So I allowed myself to use it for the first time, and I wanted to do Ethereal Knives for a little while. Testing that with Ethereal Knives meant that the projectiles would return to you and land at your feet, and thus your Ethereal Knives that leave blades would collect at your feet. When that happened, that meant that for the first time I've ever seen, Blade Blast could be used with Ethereal Knives. Outside of this interaction, if you use Ethereal Knives, you just throw blades fucking everywhere, and Blade Blast does nothing. It's shit. It could like hit a wall if a boss is right next to a wall and then maybe blow some stuff up, but that never happens. So with this setup, you could then have Ethereal Knives as your pure clear if you want, but at the same time, it did some really good damage. You could have it as a clear, and then you could also have Blade Blast as more of a single target. The only issue with that was that you had to become more of a melee character, and you had to kind of build a bit thicker for that. So in this build, in this strict version that I did, the Blade Blast was a bit more of an afterthought, but it was still a really cool proof of concept, and given that we now have a returning projectiles support gem coming our way in the new league in like a week time, you should be able to do Ethereal Knives, returning projectiles, and then Blade Blast without the need for a Nimis. So Nimis does now have a div card coming its way as well. So if it's cheap, if it's accessible, cool, we'll still be able to do a build kind of like this. If it's not, the return proj thing should be fine by itself, and it had some insane damage. So Ethereal Knives double hitting, thanks to the return proj, meant that it did some serious damage, but on top of that, the Blade Blast coming in for that big single target was also a huge single target boost. So I think we had some like Uber footage. You could also press Righteous Fire, the way I built this character, for a whole bunch of extra single target damage. Or you could not press Righteous Fire and just have a lot of sustain through the regen that I had for the energy shield and the life. On top of that, it was kind of a cold based build, so I think it had cold and lightning damage. With a lot of the cold damage that I had, it meant that I would freeze things. So a lot of the defense of the build is chilling and freezing enemies. You can see here the Maven gets absolutely shit on for damage. I was skipping phases. I was like damn near one-shotting some bosses. In a loose sense, one-shotting mean like lots of hits, but things would instantly die. Like this Cirrus here, for example, you could see a very clear indication of what the Blade Blast was doing when his health just starts chunking. So starting right about here, that's mostly Blade Blast. This is like a Uber Cirrus, and most Ubers were just getting completely dumpstered. I had to give this build of the league because it was some of the filthiest single target I've achieved up till now. And it was a pretty unique concept, and it wasn't super hard to put together, not super expensive, and at this point should be something you can do in the future. So given that it took on all content, given that it was fun, super effective, not the most expensive, had to have build a league. Effectiveness, get a 10. Enjoyment with the Nimis, with the interaction of Blade Blast, got to be a 10. The budget, not the most expensive, but if we look at the character, it did have some decent gear. Like I made sure that most of the stuff worked pretty well. Like put a bit of money in, but it's not unrealistic gear. It's going to be unrealistic early into the league, I'd say. But bunch of armor, bunch of evasion, some life, some fine-tuned like multi-modding and stuff. It's like a 20 to 30 div character, probably. The one thing that's kind of an issue is we do have Harmony of Purpose, which we stole from the Guardian. It was cheap enough at the time, like maybe 3 or 4 Divines combo. Pretty powerful thing that won't exist anymore. So you have to do charges in some other way, or just not do something like that. So the budget, I mean, can be pretty cheap. Wasn't the cheapest. I'd say something like a 6. Can it be a starter? I think these days it probably could be. I'm not sure exactly how that's going to go, and I might look into EK as a starter for myself, but got to give that 26 total, and we'll look into starter viability for EK, but with the returning proj support, I think the Blade Blast covers a single target nicely, so it should be kind of starter viable. Maybe not as Inquisitor, but maybe as Inquisitor. Anyway, that's that one. And the last build of the league is one that I just then made a video for, and I basically was playing 2 months after having not played PoE, something like that. I'd pretty much never taken such a long break from PoE in my life. The past 10 years I've been playing PoE religiously, with maybe a few weeks off here or there to play some other games late in the league. This time around, we had Diablo 4 and plenty of other stuff coming out, so, or plenty of other stuff to do. So it was about 2 months off, and jumping back to PoE was pretty tough without a new league to start us off. This was Ice Nova and Frostbolt in bow cast on crit format, utilizing the Triggerbot setup from Saboteur. It's an absolutely ridiculous looking setup because there's so much going on here with the Ice Novas and the Frostbolts and the return proj on Frostbolts. that, yeah, it's just not even going to look like anything on this fucking video, I'm pretty sure. So probably check the previous video if you want to see anything about this. But it was a build that ended up clearing really nicely, doing some okay single target, being pretty fun, being somewhat safe because you freeze everything. And I did have a lot of evasion. I had spell suppress. We had the blind node from Saboteur, so we weren't, you know, super squishy, but we weren't super durable either. Either way, decent proof of concept for a bow cast on crit character. You could put pretty much anything in this setup and have a relatively decent success. Not sure what else there is to say about that, given that I just then made a video on it. I wouldn't really recommend you go ahead and make something like this, but you certainly could if you really like the look of it. What else can we say? I'd say there's much more powerful bow cast on crit setups to do, create, make, copy. Like past few bow cast on crit builds I've done in the form of like Detonate Dead and Blade Blast, stuff like that, or the Inquisitor that was Voltaxic. They're all going to be much more insane builds. This is just if you want a lot of spell spam and a Saboteur and trigger bots. So, I don't know. Kind of a mid build in the end, given that I've made some really nice bow cast on crits in the past, and probably just much better to divert your energy towards those instead of this. It was just a character I made so I could get back into the game and try and finish challenges for Crucible League. So we've got an effectiveness of, let's say, about a 7. Boss damage wasn't great. The clear was pretty cool. The enjoyment, it was pretty fun. But honestly, a bit blinding, and you do get sick of not being able to see the screen. The budget, not very budget. Took some gear, some very specific stuff, especially the bow, cast on crit. Can it be a starter? Nah, we went over that. It can't be a starter. As I was just talking in the video previously, you don't really ever want to do cast on crit as a starter character unless you really know what you're doing, because what it essentially entails is building a spell-based character that eventually transitions to cast on crit, going to be at something like level 80 if we're talking a pure starter at the start of a league. So not particular. The total on that one is a nice, healthy, or somewhat surprising 19. Not the worst. In any case, that is the Crucible build review for this league, I suppose we'll say. Overall, had some really good builds, had some out there builds. Let's go into full cam mode. We had some pretty out there builds, a lot of ingenuity this league with the Crucible additional modifiers that changed a lot of builds. I still had something like 5 to 10 builds I could have done and kind of wanted to do, but because we started playing Diablo 4, didn't really get around to it. And then as well as that, Crucible did get a bit of a bad rap from a lot of people, and the overall community perception of it was pretty low, and it wasn't the most positive environment to stream it in. So it wasn't too bad, but it definitely could have been better and does put a bit of a dampener on your own mood. Either way, I think it was a pretty good league, just because of the viability of many different builds and skills and the versatility of lots of things. Obviously, the league mechanic wasn't the most fun to engage with, and it was also pretty overtuned in the actual monster balance and stuff. So something to be desired there for sure. Hopefully the next league's a bit of a banger. I think it's going to be more like a Sanctum, where we really like the league mechanic and then lots of good stuff around that as well. But for now, hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you enjoyed the Crucible League content I put out. I think I did a pretty good job this league with builds, but you know, it's entirely up to you guys, I suppose. So thank you very much for watching, and see you guys next time.